A single melody could be a door to a past you thought was sealed forever. Not the kind of door you opened with a key, but the kind that exploded off its hinges when you least expected it. For Sarah Mitchell and Robert Ashford, that door had been locked for 50 years, reinforced by money, silence, and the weight of choices that destroyed lives. In 3 minutes, a hummed tune would blow it wide open. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old, and she was drowning. Not in water, but in something far more suffocating. Medical bills that multiplied like parasites in the dark. Each envelope that arrived at her cramped studio apartment carried another 4-figure demand. Another reminder that her mother's lungs were failing faster than Sarah could stack dollar bills. Catherine Mitchell lay in hospice care 3 miles away at Mercy General, her chest rattling with every breath, her body consumed by a disease that had no mercy and no payment plan. The doctors gave her weeks, maybe days. The billing department gave her 30 days before collections. Sarah worked double shifts at Bernie's Diner on Congress Street, her feet swelling against the cheap sneakers she couldn't afford to replace. She smiled at customers who never looked up from their phones, poured coffee for people who left 15% tips on $20 checks, and calculated the mathematics of impossible survival in her head. Another week of shifts meant another round of her mother's morphine. Another month meant she might make the minimum payment on the credit cards she'd maxed out trying to keep her mother comfortable. Maybe. Her hands shook when she carried plates. Her eyes burned from crying in the walk-in freezer during her breaks. Her voice had gone hoarse from thanking people who treated her like furniture. But she showed up every shift because the alternative was watching her mother die without pain medication, and that wasn't an alternative at all. Robert Ashford was 72 years old, and he was insulated. Not protected, insulation implied something worth protecting, but sealed off, wrapped in $30 million, and the kind of selective memory that came with half a century of choosing comfort over truth. He'd built his fortune in shipping, turning his family's modest freight business into a New England empire. 3 grown children who called twice a year. A deceased wife who'd given him 40 years of polite, loveless marriage. A waterfront mansion in Cape Elizabeth that echoed with the footsteps of cleaning staff who knew better than to make eye contact. Every Tuesday evening at 6:30, Robert occupied the corner booth at Bernie's Diner like a king surveying peasant land. He ate the meatloaf special, drank 2 cups of black coffee, and read the financial section of the Portland Press-Herald. His silver cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. His tailored wool coat hung on the hook beside him, probably worth more than Sarah made in 6 months. He never learned the servers' names. He tipped exactly 18%, calculated to the penny. He existed in the diner, but not of it, separated from the working-class desperation around him by an invisible curtain of wealth and willful blindness. 2 people, 2 worlds, one waiting to collide with the force of 50 years of buried truth. This wasn't a fairy tale. There would be no fairy godmother, no magic wand, no happily ever after wrapped in a neat bow. This was the story of how a forgotten lullaby exposed 50 years of silence and shattered 2 families' carefully constructed lies. How a moment of recognition in a greasy diner became an earthquake that toppled empires built on cowardice. How a dying woman's song proved that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how much money you throw at the grave. Bernie's Diner smelled like grease and desperation, the kind of place where dreams went to get refills they couldn't afford. The air hung heavy with the scent of burnt coffee, dishwater, and fryer oil that had been used one day too many. October rain hammered against the foggy windows, turning Congress Street outside into a watercolor painting of blurred headlights and shadows. The vinyl booths were cracked and peeling, exposing yellow foam underneath like wounds that wouldn't heal. The linoleum floor was a map of scuff marks and stains, each one a story of struggle. The dinner rush moved through the diner in waves of exhaustion. Construction workers with cement dust still in their hair. Single mothers counting change for their kids' grilled cheese sandwiches. Old men nursing coffee for 2 hours because it was warmer than their apartments. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made everyone look tired, even the people who just walked in. Sarah moved through it all like a ghost, her mind somewhere else entirely. She was calculating. Always calculating. If she picked up Maria's Friday night shift, that was another $100. If she skipped lunch for the rest of the week, she could save maybe 30. If she called the hospital billing office and begged for another extension, they might give her 2 more weeks before they sent her mother's account to collections. She didn't see the tsunami coming. None of them did. Because in 2 minutes, Robert Ashford would hum a melody he thought had died 50 years ago. And Sarah Mitchell would hear her mother's voice in that hum, the voice that had sung her to sleep every night of her childhood, the voice that was now barely a whisper in a hospice room 3 miles away. Some doors didn't just open. They exploded. And when the smoke cleared, nothing would ever be the same. The lullaby was called The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, and it was older than anyone could remember. Catherine Mitchell had learned it from her grandmother, who'd learned it from her grandmother before that. Passed down through generations of women who'd lived along the Maine coast and watched their men sail away into storms that didn't always bring them back. The melody was haunting in the way only truly old songs could be, simple enough for a child to learn, complex enough to carry the weight of a century's worth of grief. The lyrics told the story of a young woman who waited on rocky shores for a sailor who'd promised to return. She lit a lamp every night in the lighthouse window, a beacon calling him home across impossible distances. Years passed. Storms came and went. The lamp never went out. The melody moved like waves, rising with hope, falling with despair, circling back to the same refrain about promises kept and love that survived everything except time itself. Catherine Mitchell had been a singer once. Not famous, but the kind of beautiful voice that made strangers in coffeehouses stop their conversations mid-sentence and listen. Throughout the 1970s, she performed at small venues across New England, the Lighthouse Cafe in Boston, the Red Door in Cambridge, folk clubs in Providence and Portsmouth, where the audiences sat cross-legged on the floor and passed wine bottles between songs. She sang traditional ballads and wrote her own material. But The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter was always her closing number, the song that left audiences silent and aching. She'd told Sarah it was a family heirloom, passed down through her maternal line like a precious inheritance. She'd sung it to infant Sarah every night, her voice soft in the darkness of their cramped apartment, the melody wrapping around them like a blanket against a world that was cold and unforgiving. As Sarah grew, the song became the soundtrack of her childhood. Hummed while Catherine cooked dinner, sung softly during thunderstorms when Sarah couldn't sleep, played on an old cassette tape Catherine had recorded in some long-ago studio session. Now Catherine is dying, and the song was all Sarah had left. She'd recorded her mother's morphine-clouded voice on her phone 3 days ago, capturing what might be the last time Catherine ever sang it. The recording was only 43 seconds long. Catherine's voice was fractured, barely more than a whisper, the melody broken by pauses where she struggled to breathe. But it was there, every note exactly as Sarah remembered, every rise and fall of the ancient tune that had traveled through generations to reach this moment. Sarah played it every morning during her commute, trying to memorize every tremor and pause before her mother's voice disappeared forever. She didn't know that the same melody haunted someone else's dreams. She didn't know that 3 miles away, in a mansion overlooking Casco Bay, an old man hummed it unconsciously while reading the morning paper. She didn't know that in 2 minutes, her entire understanding of that song and her entire life would shatter like glass. Tuesday evening at 6:32, Robert Ashford sat in his usual corner booth, the financial section of the Portland Press Herald spread before him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. His silver cufflinks caught the light from the buzzing fluorescent fixture overhead. The meatloaf special steamed on the plate Sarah had delivered 3 minutes earlier, along with black coffee in a chipped ceramic mug. Sarah was refilling the coffee when she heard it. At first, it was so quiet she thought she'd imagined it, a low humming barely audible above the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the fryer. But then it grew clearer, and her entire body went rigid. The coffee pot trembled in her hand, hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Robert Ashford was humming. Eyes still on his newspaper, completely unaware, he hummed a melody that Sarah had heard every day of her 28 years. The exact same tune. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. Every note, every rise and fall, every haunting turn of phrase that made the song unmistakable. The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. The family heirloom her mother swore had been passed down through generations of women in their bloodline. The song Catherine claimed was theirs alone, a secret inheritance from great-grandmothers who'd lived and died along the rocky Maine coast. Sarah's vision tunneled. The diner sounds faded to white noise. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "This song is ours, baby. It's been in our family for longer than anyone can remember. Your great-great-grandmother sang it to your great-grandmother. She sang it to my mother. My mother sang it to me. And I sing it to you." But Robert Ashford was humming it. This wealthy stranger who'd never said more than coffee. Black, in the 2 years Sarah had been serving him. This man who existed in a completely different universe from Sarah and her dying mother and their tiny apartment where medical bills piled up like accusations. How was this possible? Sarah's hand shook so violently that coffee splashed onto the table. Robert looked up, irritated, but whatever complaint he'd been about to voice died when he saw her face. "That song," Sarah whispered. Her voice came out strangled, barely audible. "That song, my mother used to sing it." The color drained from Robert Ashford's face so quickly he looked like he might pass out. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles going white. For 3 seconds he didn't breathe. The newspaper crumpled beneath his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and dangerous, the kind of control that came from decades of boardroom negotiations and hostile takeovers. "That's impossible." "I know that song," Sarah insisted, louder now. Her voice carried across the diner. Other customers were starting to look. "My mother sings it. She's sung it my whole life. She said it was passed down from her grandmother. That song died 50 years ago." Robert's words came out like a verdict, final and absolute. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your mother is either mistaken or lying." The words hit Sarah like a slap. "My mother doesn't lie. Everyone lies." Robert pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket, his movements sharp and angry, especially about things they want to be true. "She's dying." Sarah's voice cracked. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of him. She's in hospice right now, and that song is the only thing she has left, and you're telling me." "I'm telling you it's impossible." Robert threw a $100 bill on the table. 3 times what his meal cost, an insult delivered through money. "And I suggest you stop making a scene." He grabbed his coat and turned toward the door. The entire diner had gone quiet now, everyone watching the confrontation unfold like spectators at an accident. Something snapped inside Sarah. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the weight of 2 years of smiling through her own slow-motion disaster, while rich men like Robert Ashford tipped 18% and thought they were generous. "My mother is dying," she called after him, her voice ringing through the silence. "And before she does, I'm going to prove she told the truth. About that song. About everything." Robert Ashford froze in the doorway. For a moment, Sarah thought he might turn around, might say something that would make sense of the impossible thing that had just happened. But he didn't. He walked out into the October rain without looking back, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of Bernie's diner with a coffee pot in her shaking hands and a world that had just been turned inside out. The other customers slowly returned to their meals, uncomfortable with the raw emotion they'd witnessed. The cook rang the bell for an order. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything returned to normal, except nothing would ever be normal again. Catherine Mitchell had been 22 years old in the summer of 1974, and she'd been full of dreams that felt achievable when the sun set over Boston Harbor. She performed 6 nights a week at the Lighthouse Cafe in the North End, a cramped venue that smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled beer, where poets and musicians gathered to pretend they were changing the world. Her voice was pure and haunting, the kind that made drunk college students stop mid-conversation and listen with something like reverence. She sang traditional folk ballads mostly, songs about workers and sailors and women left behind. But her closing number was always The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, the song her grandmother had taught her during childhood summers in Kennebunkport. When Catherine sang it, the room transformed. Hardened longshoremen wiped their eyes. Young couples held hands a little tighter. Something about that melody reached inside people and touched places they'd forgotten existed. The Cambridge folk scene knew her name. Club owners called her directly for bookings. A producer from a small record label had approached her about cutting a demo. Catherine Mitchell was on the verge of something real, something that might lift her out of the waitressing jobs and cramped apartment she shared with 3 other aspiring artists. The future glowed with possibility. And then she met him. He came to the Lighthouse Cafe on a humid July evening, clearly slumming from whatever wealthy world he normally inhabited. Designer clothes that looked wrong in the bohemian crowd. Perfect posture that spoke of expensive prep schools. But when Catherine sang, he'd watched her like she was the only person in the room, and after a set, he'd bought her a drink and told her she had the most beautiful voice he'd ever heard. His name was Robert. He came back the next night, and the next. They talked for hours after her performances about music and dreams and the lives they wanted to build. He told her he worked in his family's shipping business but hated it, that he wanted something more meaningful than profit margins and quarterly reports. She told him about her grandmother's songs and the lighthouse, where she'd spent childhood summers watching storms roll in from the Atlantic. For 6 weeks, Catherine believed she'd found someone who understood her, someone who saw past the struggling folk singer to the person underneath, someone who made promises about a future they'd build together. Then she discovered she was pregnant. Robert's family made her an offer, $50,000 to disappear, a non-disclosure agreement that threatened legal consequences if she ever contacted Robert again or revealed his identity to the child. A lawyer who spoke in cold clinical terms about protecting family interests and avoiding complications. Catherine signed the papers because she was 22 and terrified and had $300 in her bank account. The money arrived 2 days later. So did the blacklisting. Suddenly, club owners who'd begged for her performances stopped returning her calls. The record producer vanished. Venues she'd played for months claimed they'd never heard of her. It took Catherine years to piece together what had happened, that Robert's family had connections throughout the Boston music scene, that they'd systematically destroyed her career to ensure she stayed silent, that the $50,000 hadn't been generosity, but payment for her erasure. She'd moved to Portland, pregnant and alone, and never sang professionally again. She got a job as a medical receptionist. She raised Sarah in a cramped apartment where the heat barely worked in winter. She never spoke about Sarah's father, except to say that some stories were better left unsung. The only thing Catherine kept from that summer was the song. She sang The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter to infant Sarah every night, the melody a connection to something that had been stolen from her. She told Sarah it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. It was easier than explaining the truth, that the song was all she had left of the future she'd lost. Now Catherine lay in room 314 at Mercy General Hospice, her body consumed by stage 4 lung disease. The medical bills had reached $180,000. Sarah worked 3 jobs, morning shift at Bernie's Diner, afternoon cleaning houses, evening shifts at a grocery store, and still couldn't make a dent in the debt. She'd maxed out 4 credit cards. Her GoFundMe had raised $3,000 from strangers who couldn't afford to give more. The doctors gave Catherine weeks, maybe days. The hospice social worker kept using phrases like quality of life and pain management options that were code for "we can make her comfortable while she dies, but only if you can pay for it." Sarah visited every morning before her shift at Bernie's, sitting beside her mother's bed and holding her hand while Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes Catherine was lucid, speaking in the careful way of someone rationing their remaining energy. More often, she was lost in morphine dreams, her voice reduced to whispers and fragments. But she still sang the song. Even when she could barely speak, Catherine hummed The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, the melody threading through her labored breathing like a lifeline to something that mattered more than the cancer eating her alive. Until Robert Ashford hummed that same melody in Bernie's Diner, Sarah had thought the song was about her grandmother's lighthouse keeper ancestry. A family history passed down through generations of coastal Maine women. Now she understood it might be about something else entirely. Someone else entirely. This wasn't just about a song anymore. This was about her mother's honor, about whether Catherine Mitchell had lied to her daughter for 28 years, or whether something far stranger and darker was happening. This was about Sarah's own identity, who her father was, why Catherine had raised her alone, what secrets had been locked behind that door Sarah had learned not to open. The hospice timeline felt like a bomb counting down. If Sarah didn't find answers soon, her mother would die without ever explaining the truth. The question that had lived quietly in the back of Sarah's mind her entire life, who was my father, suddenly felt urgent and terrifying. Because if Robert Ashford knew that song, if he'd claimed it died 50 years ago, if his face had gone white as death when Sarah said her mother sang it, what if the wealthy stranger who'd been eating meatloaf in her section every Tuesday for 2 years was connected to the locked room of her mother's past? What if the song wasn't about some romantic family mythology, but about something real and painful and deliberately hidden? Sarah's hands shook as she drove home after her shift, Robert Ashford's words echoing in her head. Your mother is either mistaken or lying. Her mother was dying. And before she died, Sarah was going to prove that Catherine Mitchell had told the truth about everything, even if that truth destroyed the careful story Sarah had built about her own life. Robert Ashford returned to his waterfront mansion in Cape Elizabeth just after 7:30, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel of his Mercedes. The house loomed before him, 6,000 square feet of glass and steel and emptiness, overlooking Casco Bay, where storm clouds gathered on the horizon. He'd built this fortress with money earned from choices he'd made 50 years ago, choices that had seemed necessary at the time. Choices that haunted him every single day. The housekeeper had left dinner in the refrigerator with reheating instructions he wouldn't follow. The house was silent except for the grandfather clock in the foyer ticking away seconds that felt increasingly precious. Robert poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching darkness swallow the bay. A waitress had recognized the song, Catherine's song. The lullaby he'd heard her sing at the Lighthouse Cafe 50 years ago, when they'd been young and stupid enough to believe love conquered practical considerations like family expectations and inheritance clauses. He'd hummed it unconsciously, the way he'd been doing for decades, never imagining anyone else would know it. Never imagining Catherine was still alive, still in Portland, still singing the song that had been theirs alone during that brief, luminous summer, before everything fell apart. That song died 50 years ago, he told the waitress. But that was a lie. The song had lived in his memory every day since 1974, haunting him through a loveless marriage to Victoria, through the building of a shipping empire, through the raising of 3 children who looked at him like a stranger, because that's what he was, a man who'd chosen wealth over truth and spent 50 years paying the price. Robert's father had delivered the ultimatum in his oak-paneled study. Marry Victoria Pemberton and secure the merger with Pemberton Shipping, or be disinherited entirely. You can have your little folk singer, or you can have your future, but you cannot have both. Robert had chosen the future. His father's lawyers had handled Catherine. The payoff, the NDA, the systematic destruction of her music career to ensure she stayed silent. Robert had told himself he had no choice, that he was being pragmatic, that Catherine would be fine with $50,000 and a clean break. He'd married Victoria 3 months later. They'd had 3 children who were now grown and estranged, scattered across the country, living their own lives, and calling maybe twice a year out of obligation rather than affection. Victoria had died 2 years ago from a stroke, and Robert had felt nothing but relief that the charade was finally over. His empire had been built on the sacrifice of the only woman he'd ever loved. And now, somehow, she was here in Portland, dying, according to the waitress. Close enough that her daughter served him meatloaf every Tuesday, while he sat in his corner booth pretending the past didn't exist. Robert couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his king-size bed in his empty mansion and heard Catherine's voice singing The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, young and pure and full of hope for a future they'd never have. He remembered the way she'd laughed after performances, the way she'd talked about the record deal she was sure would come through, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth believing in. He'd destroyed her. His family had destroyed her. And now her daughter. Robert sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The waitress had said my mother. Catherine had been pregnant when his father's lawyers paid her off. The timeline aligned perfectly. The girl was the right age, 28 or thereabouts, which meant Sarah Mitchell was his daughter. At 6 in the morning, Robert called Marcus Webb, a private investigator he'd used for business matters over the years. I need a complete background check on someone. Sarah Mitchell, waitress at Bernie's Diner on Congress Street. I need everything, birth certificate, family history, current address. I need it by tonight. Marcus asked no questions. That's why Robert paid him well. Robert spent the day pacing his empty mansion, his mind spinning through possibilities and consequences. If Sarah was his daughter, if Catherine had raised her alone for 28 years while Robert built his empire on the foundation of their destroyed relationship, the guilt wasn't new. Robert had carried it for 50 years, a weight that never lightened. But the possibility of facing it directly, of having his cowardice confronted by the living proof of what he'd abandoned, that was terrifying in a way his business rivals had never managed to achieve. By 7 that evening, Marcus Webb's report arrived via encrypted email. Robert opened it with shaking hands. Birth certificate. Sarah Catherine Mitchell, born March 15, 1997. Mother, Catherine Mitchell. Father, unknown. The timeline was perfect. 9 months after that summer in Boston. Marcus had included everything. Sarah's current address in a rundown neighborhood, her employment history at 3 different jobs, her mother's medical records showing stage for lung disease and a hospice admission 3 weeks ago. Even found the GoFundMe page Sarah had created, with its heartbreaking description of medical bills she couldn't pay and a mother who deserved better than dying in debt. Robert stared at the number, $180,000 in medical expenses. For Robert Ashford, that was a rounding error. Pocket change. Less than he'd spent renovating his kitchen 2 years ago. For Sarah Mitchell, it was insurmountable. Robert could write a check right now. Anonymously pay off every bill. Give Catherine Mitchell the comfortable death she deserved and give their daughter the financial relief that would change her life. But that would be too simple, too clean. It wouldn't address the fundamental question Sarah had shouted at him in the diner. How did he know Catherine's song? What was the connection between a shipping magnate and a dying folk singer? What truths had been buried for 50 years? If Robert paid the bills anonymously, Sarah would keep investigating. She'd made that clear. And eventually, she'd uncover everything. The NDA, the payoff, the destroyed career, the systematic erasure of her mother's entire life because Robert Ashford had been too weak to stand up to his father. Better to control the narrative. Better to approach Sarah himself, admit the connection, frame it in a way that positioned him as someone seeking redemption rather than someone who'd committed an unforgivable betrayal. Or better still, find out what really happened in 1974. Make sure his memory aligned with whatever Catherine had told Sarah. Protect himself before the truth exploded in ways he couldn't control. Robert closed the report and poured himself another scotch. Outside his windows, the bay churned under gathering storm clouds. Inside his chest, 50 years of carefully buried guilt clawed its way toward the surface, demanding acknowledgement he wasn't sure he was brave enough to give. The waitress had challenged him. Sarah Mitchell, his daughter, though she didn't know it yet. She'd stood in that diner and promised to prove her mother told the truth. Robert understood what that meant. It meant investigating. It meant questions. It meant the possibility of everything he'd built crumbling beneath the weight of choices he'd made when he was young and weak and more afraid of his father than of his own conscience. He had 2 choices: help Sarah uncover the truth and face the consequences, or bury the truth deeper and hope a dying woman's daughter would eventually give up. Robert had chosen the coward's path once before. It had cost him everything that mattered. 50 years later, standing in his empty mansion overlooking a storm-dark bay, Robert Ashford decided he was tired of being a coward. He picked up his phone and texted Marcus Webb. "I need you to find out everything about Catherine Mitchell's life after 1974. Where she went. What happened to her music career. Everything. And I need to know if she ever tried to contact me." The response came back immediately. "When do you need this?" Robert typed, "Yesterday." Because Sarah Mitchell was investigating. And if Robert was going to face the past he'd been running from for half a century, he needed to know exactly what that past looked like before it destroyed him. Sarah visited her mother the next morning before her shift at Bernie's, her mind still reeling from the confrontation with Robert Ashford. She'd barely slept, playing and replaying that moment when he'd hummed the song, try make sense of something that defied logic. Catherine lay in the hospice bed, her breathing labored, her body so frail she barely made an impression beneath the thin blanket. The morning sun filtered through the window, turning the sterile room golden, making the medical equipment look almost beautiful. Sarah pulled a chair close and took her mother's hand, paper-thin skin over bird-like bones. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "I need to ask you something." Catherine's eyes opened slowly, clouded with morphine, but still present. Still her. Baby girl. The song. "The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. You always told me it came from Grandma Rose, that it was passed down through our family." Catherine's hand tightened slightly in Sarah's. A warning or a confirmation, Sarah couldn't tell. "Someone else knows it, Mom. A man. He hummed it yesterday, and when I told him you sang it, he said that was impossible. He said the song died 50 years ago." The morphine haze cleared from Catherine's eyes, replaced by something sharp and afraid. "Who?" "Robert Ashford. He's a regular at the diner. Rich guy, older, comes in every Tuesday." Catherine made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. Her chest heaved with the effort of breathing and emotion combined. Tears slid from the corners of her eyes, tracking down her temples into her gray hair. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Who is he?" Catherine's voice came out barely above a whisper, each word an effort. "I need to tell you something. Should have told you years ago. Was too afraid, too ashamed." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. The locked room was finally opening. "Summer of 1974, Catherine began, her words slow and careful. "I was singing at the Lighthouse Cafe in Boston. 22 years old. Thought I was going to be famous." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Stupid dreams." She paused, gathering strength. Sarah waited, her mother's hand trembling in hers. "There was a man. He came to hear me sing, night after night. He was young then, handsome, rich. Said he loved my voice. Said he loved me." Catherine's eyes fixed on the ceiling, seeing something 50 years in the past. Robert. His name was Robert. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Robert Ashford? I didn't know his last name at first. He didn't want me to know. Said his family was complicated, that they wouldn't understand. I thought he was being romantic, mysterious." Catherine coughed, her whole body shaking with the effort. "I was so stupid. Mom, stop. You need to rest." "No. You need to know." Catherine's grip tightened with surprising strength. "I got pregnant. With you. And when I told him, everything changed." The hospital room seemed to tilt. Sarah felt like she was falling even though she was sitting perfectly still. "His family found out. They sent lawyers. Offered me money to disappear, to sign papers saying I'd never contact him again, never tell you who your father was. $50,000. Seemed like all the money in the world. He's my father?" Sarah's voice came out strangled. "Robert Ashford is my father? I took the money because I was scared and alone and pregnant. I thought I could still have my music career, still build something good." Catherine's tears flowed freely now, but they destroyed it. Club owners stopped booking me. The record deal disappeared. Venues I'd played for months suddenly had no memory of me. Took me years to understand they'd blacklisted me, made sure I'd never sing professionally again. They paid you to disappear and then made sure you had no choice but to stay disappeared, Sarah said slowly, the full scope of the betrayal crystallizing. "I moved to Portland, got a regular job, raised you." Catherine's voice was fading, the energy required to speak draining her visibly. "The song was the only thing I kept from that summer. Our song. His and mine. I sang it to you every night because it was the only part of him I wanted to remember. The man I thought he was before I learned what he really was. A coward, Sarah said flatly. A rich boy who chose his family's money over us. Catherine's eyes drifted closed. I'm sorry, baby girl. Sorry I lied about the song being a family heirloom. Sorry I never told you about your father. Some secrets felt easier than the truth. Sarah sat in silence, her mind reeling. Robert Ashford wasn't just some wealthy stranger who happened to know her mother's song. He was her father, the man who'd abandoned her mother, destroyed her career, and left them both to struggle alone for 28 years while he built his shipping empire and lived in his waterfront mansion. The man who'd thrown a $100 bill on the table yesterday like it was nothing, completely unaware he was tipping his own daughter. Does he know about me? Sarah asked. No. The NDA forbade me from ever contacting him or revealing his identity to you. If I violated it, I'd owe back the $50,000 plus legal fees I couldn't afford. Catherine's breathing had become more labored. But if he knows the song, if he remembers, he'll figure it out. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Bernie's asking if she could cover an extra shift tonight. Another opportunity to make money that wouldn't be enough, could never be enough. She looked at her dying mother, at the medical equipment keeping her comfortable, at the bills that would follow Sarah for years after Catherine was gone. Robert Ashford could pay these bills with pocket change. He could have paid them 28 years ago, could have supported his daughter instead of forcing her mother into poverty and silence. I'm going to find out what really happened, Sarah said quietly. I'm going to find proof of what they did to you. And I'm going to make him face it. Sarah, no. The NDA. You didn't violate anything. I found out on my own because he hummed the song in public. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand gently. You've spent 28 years being silent. I won't. Catherine's eyes opened one more time, focusing on her daughter with something like pride mixed with fear. Be careful. People with that much money don't like being exposed. They have ways of protecting themselves. Then it's time someone was braver than they are ruthless, Sarah said. She kissed her mother's forehead and left the hospice room with a purpose burning in her chest like wildfire. She didn't just need to understand what happened in 1974. She needed evidence, documentation, proof that would make Robert Ashford's denials impossible. And she needed it before her mother died, so Catherine could know that the truth had finally emerged from 50 years of enforced silence. What Sarah didn't know was that 3 miles away, in his Cape Elizabeth mansion, Robert Ashford was conducting his own investigation. And Marcus Webb was very, very good at his job. The private investigator's second report arrived at Robert's mansion at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus had worked through the night, pulling records that required both skill and questionable legality to access. Bank statements from 1974. Legal documents filed with the Massachusetts court system. Employment records from Boston music venues. And most damning of all, the non-disclosure agreement Catherine Mitchell had signed on August 15, 1974, with the Ashford Family Trust as the enforcing party. Robert read through the document with growing horror. He'd known his father had handled everything, but seeing the actual language, the threats of legal action, the clause demanding permanent silence regarding all matters pertaining to the Ashford family, the acknowledgement that Catherine would make no attempt to contact Robert Ashford or any member of his family, including any progeny resulting from their relationship, made him physically ill. They'd known Catherine was pregnant. They'd specifically included language about progeny, which meant his father had known Robert was abandoning his own child and had built legal protections to ensure that child would never disrupt the family's carefully constructed plans. Marcus had also found the evidence of blacklisting, a series of memos between Robert's father and various business associates who owned or funded music venues throughout New England. Polite suggestions that Miss Mitchell was unreliable and not suitable for bookings. Quiet conversations about how the Ashford family would appreciate discretion in this matter. They'd systematically destroyed her career, not just paid her off, actually destroyed her ability to make a living doing the one thing she loved and was talented at. They'd forced her into silence, and then made sure that silence was her only option. Robert had known his father was ruthless in business. He hadn't realized that ruthlessness extended to ruining the life of a 22-year-old folk singer whose only crime was falling in love with his son. The bank records showed the $50,000 payment, but they also showed something else. A second payment 6 months later, $25,000, paid to ensure Catherine's continued discretion. Robert had never known about the second payment, which meant his father had continued to monitor Catherine, had seen her struggling, and had paid her more money to make sure she stayed gone. Marcus's report concluded with current information. Subject Catherine Mitchell is currently in hospice care at Mercy General, Portland, Maine. Stage 4 lung disease, prognosis terminal. Medical expenses currently total $180,000. Daughter Sarah Mitchell working 3 jobs to pay bills. Family GoFundMe has raised $3,000 of $200,000 goal. Robert sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth built on his father's ruthless business practices, and understood the full scope of what he'd done. He'd chosen comfort over courage. He'd let his father handle the problem of his pregnant girlfriend, never asking questions about what handling it entailed. He'd married Victoria, had 3 children, built his empire, and told himself he'd made the practical choice. But the practical choice had destroyed 2 lives, Catherine's and the daughter he'd never known. Sarah Mitchell was his daughter, the waitress who'd serve him meatloaf every Tuesday for 2 years, who smiled politely while her feet ached and her mother died and her credit cards maxed out. His daughter, struggling through multiple jobs to pay medical bills that Robert could eliminate with a single phone call to his accountant. The guilt Robert had carried for 50 years crystallized into something sharper and more unbearable. The understanding that he could have fixed this at any point. He could have searched for Catherine after his father died. He could have violated the NDA his father created and faced the consequences. He could have been brave enough to choose truth over convenience. But he hadn't. And now Catherine was dying, and Sarah was investigating, and the carefully constructed walls Robert had built around his past were crumbling. Marcus's report included one more piece of information. Subject Sarah Mitchell made inquiries at Boston Public Library yesterday, requesting records from 1974 related to the Lighthouse Cafe and folk music venues. Also contacted 3 venues directly asking about booking records for Catherine Mitchell. Sarah was investigating just as Robert was. She was piecing together the same story from the opposite direction. And when their investigations collided, which they inevitably would, Sarah would learn that the wealthy stranger who'd dismissed her mother as a liar was actually her father, the man who'd abandoned them both. Robert poured himself a drink with shaking hands. He had 2 choices: approach Sarah now, admit everything, and face her justified rage directly, or wait for her to uncover the truth on her own and face consequences he couldn't control. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Subject, Sarah Mitchell just entered Mercy General Hospice. Want me to continue surveillance? Robert stared at the message. His daughter was visiting his dying ex-girlfriend, the woman he'd loved more than anyone before or since, whose life he'd helped destroy because he'd been too weak to stand up to his father. He could go there right now, walk into that hospice room, face Catherine after 50 years, meet his daughter properly instead of as the waitress he'd been tipping 18% without even learning her name. Robert typed back, "No, I'll handle this myself." Because Sarah Mitchell had challenged him in that diner. She'd promised to prove her mother told the truth. And Robert had spent 50 years running from the truth. It was time to stop running. It was time to be the man he should have been in 1974, even if it meant facing the full weight of choices that had destroyed lives. Robert Ashford stood, straightened his tie, and prepared to walk directly into the wreckage of his past, armed with nothing but the truth and a slim hope for redemption that probably didn't exist. Some doors didn't just open, they exploded. And Robert had spent 50 years holding the match, terrified of the fire, but knowing deep down that eventually, inevitably, everything would burn. Robert Ashford returned to Bernie's diner 3 days later, timing his arrival for 9:30 at night when the dinner rush had thinned and Sarah's shift was ending. He sat in his usual corner booth, But this time he didn't order. He just waited, his hands folded on the table, his expensive coat draped over the cracked vinyl seat like a flag of surrender. Sarah saw him the moment she pushed through the kitchen doors with a tray of dirty dishes. Her entire body went rigid. For a moment, she considered walking straight past him, ignoring his presence the way he'd ignored her existence for 28 years. But curiosity won over anger. She needed answers more than she needed the satisfaction of making him feel invisible. She dropped the dishes in the kitchen and clocked out. When she emerged, pulling on her threadbare jacket against the October cold, Robert was standing in the parking lot beside a Mercedes that probably cost more than Sarah would earn in 5 years. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "I'm done listening to you call my mother a liar." Sarah's voice was ice. "I know." Robert's face looked haggard in the parking lot lights, shadows carving deep lines around his eyes. "I know because I knew your mother. I loved her. And I abandoned her." The words hung in the cold air between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. 50 years ago, I was 24 years old and engaged to marry a woman I didn't love because my family demanded it. Your mother sang at a coffee house in Boston, and the first time I heard her voice, I understood what it meant to want something more than money or status or my father's approval. Robert's hands shook slightly. We had one summer together. One perfect, impossible summer. And then you left her pregnant and alone. Sarah's voice cracked despite her attempt to stay cold. "I didn't know she was pregnant when I left. I was a coward who chose my inheritance over love, and by the time I realized what I'd done, my family had already paid her to disappear. They handled everything." Robert met her eyes directly. "I let them handle everything because it was easier than being brave." Sarah wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand how someone could be so weak, so selfish, so utterly lacking in basic human decency. Instead, she asked the question that had burned in her mind since her mother's confession. "Do you know who I am?" "You're my daughter, Sarah Catherine Mitchell, born March 15th, 28 years ago. I hired an investigator. I've known for 3 days." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been sitting 3 tables away from my own daughter for 2 years, tipping 18% like that was generous, never bothering to learn your name." The admission hit harder than Sarah expected. She leaned against her decade-old Honda, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I want to pay your mother's medical bills," Robert continued. "All of them. I want to set up a trust fund for you. I want to." "You can't buy forgiveness." Sarah's voice was sharp as broken glass. "You think writing a check erases 50 years? You think money fixes what you did to her? No, but it's what I can offer." Robert pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "There's a cashier's check in here for $200,000. Enough to cover every bill and give you breathing room. Take it. Your mother deserves to die in peace, not in debt." Sarah stared at the envelope like it was a snake, every fiber of her being screamed to refuse it, to throw his blood money back in his face. But her mother was dying. The bills were real. Pride didn't pay for morphine. She didn't take the envelope. There's more to this story, isn't there? You didn't just come here to confess and write a check. Robert's expression shifted, relief mixed with something darker. "You're right. My family didn't just pay your mother off. There's more, much more." "Then tell me." Robert glanced around the empty parking lot, then back at Sarah. "Not here. Tomorrow. There's someone else involved, someone who orchestrated everything, and he's still alive, still powerful, still protecting the lies he built." He paused. "I need your help to expose him, and you need mine to get justice for your mother. Subscribe before this story twists deeper than you expect." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You need my help? The daughter you abandoned needs to help you." "Yes, because the man who destroyed your mother's life isn't me, not entirely. It was my brother, and he's still out there, still capable of making problems disappear." Robert's eyes held hers. "I was weak, but he was cruel. And if we want the truth to come out, if we want your mother to know that justice was finally served, we need to work together." Every instinct told Sarah to walk away. But she thought of her mother lying in that hospice bed, believing she'd been abandoned and forgotten, her career destroyed, her voice silenced for 50 years. If there was more to the story, if someone had deliberately orchestrated that destruction, then Sarah needed to know. Her mother deserved to know. "Tell me everything," Sarah demanded. "Right now. Every detail. And then I'll decide if I can stand to be in the same room with you long enough to get justice." Robert nodded slowly. "My brother's name is Thomas Ashford, and he's a monster I helped create by being too weak to stop him." The parking lot suddenly felt colder. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and prepared to hear truths that would reshape everything she understood about her mother's past and her own existence. Robert began speaking, and the words that followed would bind them together in an alliance neither wanted, but both desperately needed. Because some truths required unlikely partnerships, and some justice required the abandoned and the abandoner to stand together against something worse than either of them alone. Thomas Ashford had been 30 years old in 1974, already positioning himself to take control of the family shipping business. Robert had been the heir apparent, their father's favorite, charming and personable, where Thomas was calculating and cold. But Robert had shown weakness by falling in love with a coffeehouse singer, and Thomas had seen opportunity in that weakness. "Thomas wanted me to marry Victoria Pemberton," Robert explained, his voice flat with the weight of old pain. "Her family owned Pemberton Shipping. A merger between our companies would create the largest shipping operation in New England. But that only worked if I married Victoria, not if I ran off with a folk singer from nowhere." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "So he paid my mother to disappear. It was more than payment. It was systematic destruction." Robert pulled out his phone, scrolling through documents Marcus Webb had uncovered. "Thomas didn't just offer your mother money. He threatened her, told her that if she didn't sign the NDA and leave Boston, he'd make sure she never worked again. Not just in music, anywhere. He had connections to police, to landlords, to employers. He made it clear that refusing his offer meant complete ruin." He showed Sarah a memo, yellowed with age but clear enough. Thomas's handwriting detailed exactly how to handle the Mitchell situation. Financial incentive combined with career destruction, ensuring Catherine had no choice but to take the money and stay silent. "Your mother signed because she was terrified and alone and pregnant with me," Sarah said quietly, reading the cold, clinical language Thomas had used to describe destroying a woman's life. She signed, and then Thomas made good on his threats anyway. He contacted every music venue in New England where Catherine had performed, told them she was unreliable, difficult, potentially litigious, suggested that booking her would jeopardize their relationship with Ashford Shipping, which meant loss of business. Robert's jaw tightened. He blacklisted her systematically, not because she'd violated the NDA, but because he enjoyed the power of it, because he wanted to prove he could erase someone completely. Sarah's vision blurred with rage. "Why?" "Because I chose the conventional path. I married Victoria. I joined the family business. And Thomas wanted to make sure I never had second thoughts, never wondered about the woman I'd abandoned. If Catherine was successful and happy, I might regret my choice. But if she was broken and disappeared, I'd convince myself I'd made the right decision." Robert's voice cracked. "He destroyed her to protect my compliance. And it worked." Sarah's words were an accusation and a fact. It worked. Thomas became CEO when our father retired. He built an empire on ruthlessness, I enabled by being too weak to fight back. Victoria and I had 3 children who grew up in a house without love. I told myself I'd made the practical choice, the responsible choice. I never asked what happened to Catherine because I was afraid of the answer. Robert showed Sarah more documents, financial records showing payments from Thomas Ashford to music industry gatekeepers, venue owners, even a radio DJ who'd been about to feature Catherine's demo recording. 23 separate payments over 6 months, each one designed to close another door, eliminate another opportunity. "He's still alive," Robert said. "Thomas is 75 years old, still on the board of Ashford Shipping, still protecting the family image." When I hired Marcus Webb to investigate, Marcus discovered something else. He pulled up a series of photographs on his phone. Thomas has been monitoring you. Sarah's blood ran cold. The photos showed her at different ages, maybe 7 years old walking to school, 13 at a track meet, 18 at high school graduation, 23 leaving Bernie's diner after a shift. Someone had been taking pictures of her throughout her entire life. Why? The word came out strangled. Insurance. In case Catherine ever tried to contact me or violate the NDA. Thomas wanted documentation that he could use to prove she'd been raising my daughter, which would constitute a violation. He was prepared to sue her into complete poverty if she ever spoke up. Robert's hands shook as he held the phone. He's been watching you for 28 years, Sarah, making sure the secret stayed buried. Sarah felt violated in a way she couldn't articulate. A stranger, her uncle, she realized with disgust, had been surveilling her entire life, documenting her existence as potential ammunition against her dying mother. "I want to destroy him," Sarah said quietly. The words surprised her with their venom, but they felt right. "I want everyone to know what he did." So do I. But Thomas is powerful. He has lawyers, connections, money. Exposing him requires evidence, so overwhelming he can't bury it. Robert met her eyes. "I have resources, investigators, legal experts, access to family records Thomas thinks are hidden. You have something more valuable, the moral authority of being his victim. Together, we can build a case that destroys him publicly." "Why would you turn against your own brother?" "Because he's not my brother. He's a monster I helped create by being complicit in his cruelty." Robert's voice hardened. "And because your mother is dying, and before she does, she deserves to know that the people who destroyed her life faced consequences." Sarah looked at the envelope still in Robert's hand, at the phone displaying surveillance photos of her childhood, at the man who was her father standing before her like a penitent seeking absolution he didn't deserve. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness required something Robert hadn't earned and might never earn. But justice was something they could pursue together. "I have conditions," Sarah said. "We do this before my mother dies. She gets to hear the truth, gets to know that Thomas faced consequences. And when this is over, you don't get to play father. You lost that right 50 years ago." "Agreed. And every piece of evidence we find, every truth we uncover, I control how it's used. This is my mother's story, not yours." "Agreed." Sarah finally took the envelope, not because she'd forgiven Robert Ashford, but because her mother's medical bills were real and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Our quest for truth is now inextricably linked," she said, the words tasting bitter but necessary. "But don't mistake an alliance for absolution." Robert nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to finally do the right thing, even if it's 50 years too late." They stood in the parking lot of Bernie's diner, the place where this had all begun with a hummed melody, and formed an alliance built on shared purpose rather than trust. The abandoned daughter and the coward father, united against the monster who'd orchestrated both their tragedies. Thomas Ashford had spent 50 years believing his secrets were safe, protected by money and power and the silence of people too afraid or too broken to fight back. He was about to learn that some truths refused to stay buried, and some victims eventually found allies in the most unlikely places. The investigation began the next morning in the climate-controlled archives of the Boston Public Library. Sarah and Robert sat at adjacent computer terminals, scrolling through digitized newspaper records from 1974, searching for traces of Catherine Mitchell's brief moment in the spotlight before it was systematically extinguished. Sarah found the first piece of evidence at 11:15, a review in the Boston Phoenix from July 1974, praising Catherine's performance at the Lighthouse Cafe. "Miss Mitchell possesses the kind of voice that makes you believe in the power of song to transform ordinary moments into something transcendent. Her interpretation of traditional ballads breathes new life into familiar material, while her original compositions suggest a songwriter of remarkable depth. Watch this name. Catherine Mitchell is going places." 3 weeks later, the same reviewer mentioned Catherine's cancellation at a Cambridge venue. No explanation, just a brief note that the previously scheduled Catherine Mitchell will not be performing this weekend. Then nothing. The name Catherine Mitchell disappeared from Boston music coverage entirely, as though she'd never existed. Robert found the booking records at the Massachusetts Historical Society, buried in the archived business papers of the Lighthouse Cafe. Catherine had been scheduled for 12 performances between August and December 1974. Every single one was canceled after August 15th, the day she'd signed the NDA. The cancellation notes were identical, per management request. Ashford family concerns. They didn't even try to hide it, Sarah said, photographing the records with her phone. They documented their own conspiracy. Marcus Webb, working on Robert's instructions, uncovered the financial records. Thomas Ashford had made payments totaling $75,000 to various music industry figures between August and December 1974. The memo lines were vague: consulting fee, business advice, discretionary payment. But Marcus had tracked down 3 of the recipients. 2 were deceased. The third, a former booking agent named Leonard Hayes, was 83 and living in a nursing home in Quincy. Sarah and Robert visited him on a gray Thursday afternoon. Leonard's memory was sharp despite his age, and when they mentioned Catherine Mitchell's name, his face clouded with something like shame. "I remember her. Beautiful voice. Should have been famous." He looked at his hands, liver-spotted and trembling. "I got a call from Thomas Ashford in August of '74. He offered me $5,000 to make sure Catherine Mitchell never got booked at any venue I worked with. Said it was a family matter, that the girl had caused problems, that it would be best for everyone if she just went away." "Did he threaten you?" Sarah asked. "Didn't have to. $5,000 was more than I made in 3 months. And Thomas Ashford was the kind of man who could destroy your career with a phone call. So I took the money, and I made sure Catherine's name got quietly removed from consideration." Leonard's eyes watered. "I've thought about her over the years. Wondered what happened to that voice. I'm not proud of what I did." Sarah recorded his confession on her phone. Legal evidence, testimony from someone with no reason to lie 50 years later. They found more witnesses. A sound engineer who'd recorded Catherine's demo remembered being told the session was canceled due to legal complications involving the Ashford family. A club owner in Cambridge recalled Thomas Ashford visiting personally, making it clear that booking Catherine Mitchell would result in Ashford shipping, refusing to transport any goods for businesses that used his venue. "It wasn't subtle," the club owner said. "Thomas Ashford wanted everyone to know he could destroy you if you helped that girl. So we all made the practical choice. We chose our businesses over her career." The pattern was clear and documented: systematic, deliberate destruction orchestrated by one man with enough power to make everyone complicit. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a music historian at Boston University, specializing in the 1970s folk scene, provided expert analysis when Sarah and Robert brought her the evidence. She examined Catherine's demo recording, reviewed the timeline of her disappeared career, and traced the history of the lighthouse keeper's daughter. "This song predates both your families by at least a century," Dr. Rodriguez explained, pulling up references to similar maritime ballads from the 1800s. "It's a regional folk song that was passed down orally through coastal communities. Your mother learning it from her grandmother is entirely plausible. It was part of the cultural heritage of New England fishing families." She paused, reading through the documented evidence of Catherine's blacklisting. "What happened to your mother is a textbook case of industry blacklisting. I've seen this pattern before. Someone with power making a systematic effort to erase a performer from the cultural record. But this is particularly vicious because your mother was on the verge of real success. That demo recording is extraordinary. With proper promotion, she could have had a significant career." The expert testimony provided context that transformed individual pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative of deliberate sabotage. Marcus Webb's most disturbing discovery came from Thomas Ashford's personal files, which Marcus had accessed through methods he refused to specify. Photographs of Sarah spanning 28 years, each one carefully dated and filed. Surveillance reports noting her addresses, her schools, her employment. A memo from 2015 discussing maintaining awareness of potential NDA violations through subjects' social media presence. Thomas had been watching Sarah her entire life, documenting her existence, as insurance against Catherine ever speaking up. The surveillance had continued even after Catherine had spent decades in silence, even after any reasonable threat had passed. Thomas had maintained his watch simply because he could, because power enjoyed exercising itself even when unnecessary. The legal documents told their own story. Robert's lawyer, given access to the original NDA, highlighted language that went far beyond standard confidentiality agreements. Clauses about permanent silence regarding all matters, threats of legal action to the fullest extent permissible by law, requirements that Catherine make no attempt to contact any member of the Ashford family, directly or indirectly, for any reason whatsoever. This isn't a non-disclosure agreement, the lawyer said flatly. This is a threat document designed to terrify a young woman into complete silence. Several of these clauses probably wouldn't hold up in court, but that doesn't matter. The point was to make her too afraid to ever test them. The final piece of evidence was scientific and irrefutable. Sarah and Robert visited a private DNA testing facility in Portland, provided samples, and requested expedited processing. 3 days later, the results arrived. 99.9% probability of paternal relationship. Robert Ashford was definitively Sarah Mitchell's biological father. The scientific proof eliminated any possibility of doubt, any room for Thomas to claim Catherine had lied about the pregnancy or that Sarah was someone else's child. The genetic evidence tied everything together: the summer romance, the abandonment, the 50 years of silence. Sarah held the DNA report in her hands and felt the weight of absolute certainty. This wasn't speculation or memory or interpretation. This was scientific fact, documented and undeniable. Robert Ashford had fathered her, abandoned her mother, and spent 28 years living 3 miles away while his daughter worked 3 jobs to keep her mother alive. They laid out all 7 types of evidence on Robert's dining room table like pieces of a puzzle that finally formed a complete picture. Historical records showing Catherine's disappeared career. Financial documents proving Thomas's payments to industry gatekeepers. Expert testimony confirming the blacklisting pattern. Witness interviews from people who'd participated in Catherine's erasure. Surveillance photographs documenting decades of monitoring. Legal documents revealing the threatening nature of the NDA. DNA evidence proving Sarah's paternity and Robert's abandonment. Together, the evidence told an irrefutable story. Thomas Ashford had systematically destroyed Catherine Mitchell's life to protect his brother's conventional marriage and secure his own path to power. He'd paid people to refuse her work, threatened venues that might book her, and monitored her daughter for nearly 3 decades to ensure the secret stayed buried. And Robert Ashford had been complicit through his silence, choosing comfort over courage for 50 years. "This is enough," Sarah said quietly, looking at the assembled evidence. "This destroys him." Robert nodded, his face drawn. Thomas is giving the keynote speech at the New England Shipping Association Gala next week. 200 people from the industry, media coverage, live stream to association members. He's being honored for his contributions to maritime commerce. Sarah met his eyes. "Then that's where we expose him. Publicly, undeniably, in front of everyone who spent decades thinking he was a pillar of the community." "Your mother needs to know first," Robert said, "before it goes public. She deserves to hear that justice is coming." For the first time since their alliance formed, Sarah felt something almost like respect for Robert Ashford. He was still a coward who'd made unforgivable choices. But at least now he was a coward trying to face the consequences, trying to give Catherine the one thing she'd been denied for 50 years, acknowledgement that she'd told the truth and that the people who destroyed her would finally be held accountable. "Tomorrow," Sarah agreed. "We tell her tomorrow. And then we end Thomas Ashford's career the same way he ended my mother's, publicly, systematically, and without mercy." If you're still watching, drop a comment. What would you do if you discovered this about your family? They began preparing for the confrontation, organizing evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. Marcus Webb arranged for video equipment and coordinated with a journalist Robert trusted to ensure media coverage. Sarah practiced what she would say, how she would stand before a room full of wealthy strangers and tell them the truth about one of their own. The evidence was overwhelming. The moment was chosen, and Catherine Mitchell, dying in her hospice bed 3 miles away, was about to learn that her voice, silenced for 50 years, was finally going to be heard. Thomas Ashford had built his empire on the belief that money and power could bury any truth, silence any victim, erase any inconvenient reality. He'd spent 5 decades proving that belief correct, watching his brother's abandoned daughter struggle through life while he maintained surveillance to protect secrets that enriched him. He was about to learn that some truths refuse to stay buried, and some victims eventually find allies willing to burn everything down to expose them. The gala was in 6 days. The evidence was compiled. The alliance between the abandoned daughter and the coward father had transformed into something harder and more focused, a weapon aimed directly at the heart of Thomas Ashford's carefully constructed reputation. Justice delayed wasn't justice denied. Sometimes it was justice sharpened to a point that could pierce through decades of lies and finally draw blood. The Portland Museum of Art gleamed like a jewel box on Friday evening, its glass facade reflecting the lights of Congress Square. Inside, 200 of Maine's elite gathered for the Ashford Foundation annual gala. Politicians in tailored suits, business leaders whose handshakes sealed million-dollar deals, philanthropists whose charity masked the sources of their wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables draped in ivory linen. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than Sarah made in a week at Bernie's Diner. Thomas Ashford stood at the center of it all, 75 years old and radiating the confidence of a man who'd spent 5 decades believing himself untouchable. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His tuxedo fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, his smile practiced and empty, his eyes calculating which conversations would benefit him most. Tonight, he was being honored for his philanthropic contributions to Maine's maritime heritage. A bronze plaque with his name would be mounted in the museum's lobby. The governor herself would present the award. Local news cameras captured every moment for the evening broadcast. Thomas Ashford had no idea he was standing at his own execution. Robert had secured an invitation for Sarah as his guest, introducing her to anyone who asked as a family friend. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from a coworker, feeling intensely out of place among women dripping with jewelry that could pay her mother's medical bills 3 times over. But she stood straight, her evidence folder clutched in her hands like a weapon, and waited for the moment that would change everything. 3 miles away, in the hospice at Mercy General, Catherine Mitchell lay propped against pillows, an iPad positioned so she could watch the gala's live stream. A hospice nurse sat beside her, monitoring her oxygen levels, ready to intervene if the stress became too much. Catherine's breathing was labored, her body failing rapidly, but her eyes were clear and focused on the screen. She'd insisted on watching. "I've been silent for 50 years, she told Sarah that morning, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to see his face when the truth finally speaks." The dinner concluded. Dessert plates were cleared. The lights dimmed slightly as the governor approached the podium to begin the awards presentation. She spoke about Thomas Ashford's decades of service to Maine's business community, his generous donations to maritime museums and historical societies, his commitment to preserving New England's seafaring heritage. Thomas accepted the plaque with practiced humility, his speech prepared and polished. He thanked the foundation board, acknowledged his late parents' influence, and spoke eloquently about the importance of giving back to the community that had given his family so much. Then Robert Ashford stood and walked toward the stage. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert hadn't attended foundation events in years, maintaining minimal contact with his brother after their father's death. His appearance tonight had surprised everyone. His approach to the stage during Thomas's moment of glory shocked them into silence. "I need to say something," Robert said, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "About my brother, about our family, about truths that have been buried for 50 years." Thomas's smile froze. Robert, this isn't the time. There will never be a better time. Robert took the microphone from the podium. In 1974, I fell in love with a woman named Catherine Mitchell. She was a folk singer in Boston. She had the most beautiful voice I'd ever heard. And when she told me she was pregnant with my child, I abandoned her because my family demanded I marry someone more suitable to our status. The room erupted in whispers. Phones appeared, recording everything. The news cameras swiveled from Thomas to Robert. My brother Thomas orchestrated everything, Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. He paid Catherine $50,000 to disappear, made her sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then, to ensure she stayed silent, he systematically destroyed her music career. This is absurd, Thomas said, his voice sharp with authority. Robert, you're not well. This is clearly some sort of dementia. Robert's laugh was bitter. I wish it were. I wish this was confusion rather than confession. He gestured toward Sarah. This is my daughter, Sarah Mitchell, the child I abandoned 28 years ago. And she has evidence of everything. Sarah stood, her hands steady now, and approached the stage. Staff members, uncertain but following her confident stride, projected the documents she'd prepared onto the museum's large display screens. The NDA appeared first, blown up large enough for everyone to read its threatening language. Then the financial records showing Thomas's payments to music industry gatekeepers. Then the surveillance photographs, a timeline of Sarah's life from childhood to present, each image dated and filed, proof of decades of monitoring. No, Thomas said, but his voice had lost its authority. He stared at the screens like they were showing impossible things, his face draining of color. Sarah's voice rang clear through the sound system. Thomas Ashford paid 23 different people to ensure my mother never worked in music again. Club owners, booking agents, radio DJs. He didn't just pay her to disappear. He made sure disappearing was her only option. The surveillance photos scrolled past. 7-year-old Sarah walking to school. 13-year-old Sarah at a track meet. 18-year-old Sarah at graduation. 23-year-old Sarah leaving Bernie's diner. You watched me my entire life, Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion she could no longer contain. You documented my existence, like I was a threat to be monitored. My mother signed your agreement. She stayed silent for 50 years. But you couldn't leave her alone even then. You had to make sure she stayed broken. She was nobody. Thomas's rage finally broke through his controlled facade. A coffeehouse singer who tried to trap my brother. I protected our family from a gold digger who... I never wanted his money. Catherine's voice, thin but clear, came through the live stream feed that Sarah had switched to the main screens. The audience gasped as they saw a woman in a hospice bed, oxygen tubes in her nose, her body frail, but her eyes burning with 50 years of silenced truth. I wanted him to choose love over fear. And when he couldn't, I took your money because I was 22 and terrified and pregnant. But I would have given it all back for him to be brave enough to stay. The room had gone completely silent except for Catherine's labored breathing through the speakers. You didn't just destroy my career, Catherine continued, each word an effort. You destroyed my daughter's chance to know her father. You stole 50 years from all three of us because you cared more about a business merger than human lives. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Robert cut him off. You didn't just ruin one woman's career, Thomas. You stole my daughter from me for 50 years. You made me complicit in abandoning my own child. You built your empire on my cowardice and Catherine's silence. I did what was necessary, Thomas shouted, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. You were going to throw everything away for some folk singer. I saved you from destroying our family's legacy. By destroying another family entirely, Sarah said quietly. The microphone picked up her words, carrying them through the silent room. You didn't save anything. You just chose which lives mattered and which ones didn't. The evidence kept appearing on the screens. Witness testimonies. Expert analysis. The DNA test results. every piece of the puzzle laid out for 200 witnesses, and however many thousands were watching the live stream. Subscribe now. You won't believe what happens next. Thomas tried to leave the stage, but Robert blocked his path. You're going to stay here and face what you've done. For once in your life, you're going to stand in front of the people whose respect you've bought and watch it disappear. Board members were already approaching the stage, their expressions ranging from shock to fury. The governor had stepped back, clearly wanting no association with whatever was unfolding. The phones throughout the room recorded everything, uploading to social media in real time. Within minutes, the exposure was viral, trending on Twitter, shared across Facebook, discussed on local news breaks that interrupted regular programming. Thomas Ashford's reputation, built over 75 years and protected by millions of dollars, crumbled in less than 20 minutes. The bronze plaque meant to honor his philanthropy would never be mounted. The foundation bearing his family's name would spend the next year desperately trying to distance itself from the man who'd weaponized it. Security finally arrived, escorting Thomas toward the exit as he continued shouting about family loyalty and necessary sacrifices. The crowd parted before him like he was contaminated, their faces showing the peculiar mixture of horror and satisfaction that came from watching someone powerful finally face consequences. Robert and Sarah stood together on the stage, an unlikely alliance of abandoner and abandoned, and watched Thomas Ashford's empire collapse in real time. Then Robert turned to Sarah, and for the first time in 28 years, her father embraced her. Not as a waitress he'd been tipping for 2 years. Not as a stranger whose resemblance he'd ignored, but as his daughter, the child he'd abandoned and spent 50 years trying to forget. Sarah didn't forgive him. Forgiveness required more than one moment of courage after decades of cowardice. But she accepted the embrace because they'd done what they'd set out to do. They'd exposed the truth, destroyed the man who'd orchestrated her mother's erasure, and given Catherine Mitchell something she'd been denied for 50 years, vindication. On the screen behind them, Catherine watched from her hospice bed, tears streaming down her face. Her lips moved, singing without sound, and Sarah recognized the melody even without hearing it. The lighthouse keeper's daughter. The song about waiting, about promises, about love that survived everything except time. Except maybe it had survived time after all. Just not in the way any of them expected. Catherine sang the lullaby one final time, her voice barely a whisper, but captured forever on video as 200 of Maine's elite stood in stunned silence and watched a dying woman finally speak her truth. 3 weeks after the gala, Catherine Mitchell lay in a private room at Coastal Haven Hospice, a facility that overlooked Casco Bay and charged more per day than Sarah had made in a month at Bernie's Diner. But the bills were paid, all of them, every medical expense from diagnosis to end-of-life care, eliminated with a single transfer from Robert Ashford's account. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Atlantic Ocean. Catherine could watch sailboats drift past, see storms roll in from the horizon, hear seagulls crying outside like echoes of the coastal childhood she'd spent in Kennebunkport. The medical equipment was state-of-the-art but unobtrusive. The staff was attentive without being intrusive. Everything was comfortable, peaceful, and impossibly expensive. Catherine's body was failing rapidly, the cancer consuming what little remained. But her spirit seemed lighter than Sarah had seen in years. The burden of silence had been lifted. The truth had been spoken. Thomas Ashford's empire had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, board resignations, and social ostracism that money couldn't fix. Justice, delayed by 50 years, had finally arrived. Robert visited every day, sitting beside Catherine's bed for hours, talking about the summer of 1974 and all the years they'd lost. Sometimes Catherine was lucid enough to respond, her memories of that brief, luminous time sharp despite the morphine. More often, she simply listened, holding Robert's hand while he apologized for things that couldn't be fixed, but at least could be acknowledged. "I was a coward," Robert said one afternoon, the ocean gray and turbulent beyond the windows. "I chose comfort over courage. I let my father and brother handle you like you were a problem to be solved rather than a person I loved." Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. You were young, afraid. I understand that now. Understanding doesn't mean forgiving. No, but it means I can die knowing the truth was told. That our daughter knows who you are. That Thomas faced consequences. Catherine's eyes closed, exhausted from the effort of speaking. Some victories take 50 years, but they're still victories. Sarah had quit Bernie's dine of the day after the gala, walking into her manager's office and giving notice with a lightness she'd never felt before. The weight of debt, of desperation, of working 3 jobs to stay 1 month ahead of collections. All of it lifted by money that should have been there from the beginning, but was better late than never. She'd enrolled in the music program at the University of Southern Maine, studying vocal performance and music history. Her mother's voice might have been silenced, but Sarah's wouldn't be. Catherine's story would be told through Sarah's songs, carried forward into a future that honored rather than buried the past. Robert had put his Cape Elizabeth mansion on the market, the empty house a monument to choices he wanted to leave behind. He'd found a smaller home near the university, close enough that he could have dinner with his daughter without it feeling like a wealthy stranger dispensing charity. They were building something, not a traditional father-daughter relationship, because too much time had been lost for that, but an alliance that might eventually become something like family. On a Thursday morning in late November, with frost on the windows and winter closing in, Catherine's breathing changed. The hospice staff called Sarah and Robert, their voices gentle but clear. It was time. They arrived within minutes of each other, entering Catherine's room to find her still conscious, still present, even as her body surrendered its final fight. The ocean beyond the windows was steel gray, white caps visible on the choppy surface. Seagulls wheeled against clouds that promised snow. Sarah took one of her mother's hands. Robert took the other. And Catherine looked at both of them, her daughter and the man she'd loved 50 years ago, with something like peace in her eyes. The song, she whispered, barely audible. Sing it with me. Sarah's voice came first, young and strong, and carrying her mother's genetic gift. Then Robert joined, his voice rough and untrained, but sincere. And finally Catherine, barely more than a breath, her voice fractured but still recognizable as the instrument that had once filled Boston coffeehouses with beauty. The lighthouse keeper's daughter filled the room one last time. 3 voices singing about waiting and promises and love that survived impossible distances. Catherine's eyes closed halfway through the second verse. Her breathing slowed during the third. By the final refrain, she was gone, slipping away so gently that Sarah almost didn't notice until the hand in hers went completely still. They finished the song anyway, singing to a woman who could no longer hear, but somehow felt present in the melody itself. When the last note faded, Sarah and Robert sat in silence, holding Catherine's hands, watching the ocean beyond the windows and crying for everything they'd lost and the small, insufficient victory of having at least ended with truth. Catherine's final words, whispered moments before the song began, echoed in Sarah's memory. The song was always about hope, about love surviving everything, even time. Maybe she was right. Maybe love had survived, not in the way fairy tales promised, not with happily ever after wrapped in a neat bow, but in a daughter who learned the truth, in a father who finally chose courage over comfort, in justice delivered 5 decades late, but delivered nonetheless. Thomas Ashford's downfall was systematic and complete. Federal investigators opened inquiries into Ashford Shipping's business practices, uncovering decades of questionable dealings that had nothing to do with Catherine, but everything to do with a man who believed rules didn't apply to people with sufficient wealth. He resigned from every board position, watched his fortune diminish through lawsuits and settlements, and discovered that the respect he'd bought for 75 years evaporated the moment the check cleared. The Ashford Foundation Board restructured entirely, removing Thomas's name from the organization and redirecting its mission toward supporting artists whose careers had been damaged by powerful interests. The first grant went to establishing the Catherine Mitchell Memorial Music Scholarship, providing funding for young musicians from working-class backgrounds who showed exceptional promise but lacked financial resources. Sarah became the scholarship's first administrator, reviewing applications, and selecting recipients based on talent rather than connections. She told Catherine's story to every scholarship winner, ensuring that her mother's voice, silenced for 50 years, would echo through generations of artists who got opportunities Catherine never had. Robert's 3 other children reached out tentatively after the gala, having watched their father's confession go viral and realized they had a half-sister they'd never known existed. The relationships were awkward initially. Decades of estrangement couldn't be erased overnight, but they were trying. Sunday dinners at Robert's new house. Texts exchanged between siblings, learning each other's birthdays and preferences. The slow, careful construction of family ties built on truth rather than the lies that had fractured them. True wealth wasn't what you inherited from parents who chose money over love. True wealth was the courage to face what you'd buried, to dig through decades of lies and cowardice and systematic cruelty, and finally, choose truth even when it destroyed everything you'd built on foundations of sand. Catherine Mitchell had died, but her story lived. Sarah taught The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter to her music students at the university, explaining its origins as a regional folk song that had traveled through generations before becoming the center of a 50-year conspiracy. She played the recording of her mother's voice, fractured and fading but still beautiful, and told students about a woman whose talent had been deliberately destroyed because she'd fallen in love with the wrong man. The lullaby continued, not as a secret anymore, not as something that had to be hidden or denied, but as a testament to voices that refused to be permanently silenced. Some truths took 50 years to emerge. Some justice required the abandoned and the abandoner to stand together against monsters who believed power made them invincible. Some love survived everything, even time, even death, even the systematic cruelty of people who thought money could bury anything. Like this video if Catherine's courage moved you. Subscribe for more stories where hidden truths finally emerge. Share this with someone who needs to know that truth always finds its way home, even when it takes 50 years to arrive. Sarah stood at her mother's grave 6 months later, spring flowers blooming across the cemetery, and sang The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter one more time. Her voice carried across the headstones, strong and clear, a genetic inheritance more valuable than money or status or anything the Ashford family had ever built. The song was about waiting, about promises kept across impossible distances, about love that survived everything except time. Except Catherine's love had survived time after all. It survived in Sarah's voice, in the scholarship bearing her name, in the truth that had finally been spoken and could never be buried again. Some doors exploded open after 50 years of being locked. And when the smoke cleared, what remained was truth, justice, and voices that refused to be permanently silenced, no matter how much money, power, or systematic cruelty tried to make them disappear. Catherine Mitchell had waited on rocky shores for justice that seemed like it would never arrive. But it had. Late, insufficient, unable to restore what had been stolen, but present nonetheless. And in the end, that had to be enough. Because some victories, even delayed by half a century, were still victories. And some voices, even after death, continued singing.